Okay, everyone, welcome. I just got the hi sign from Laura, and we're in our wonderful Zoom setting. All is comfortable, I hope. Welcome to all. I'm Franny Eberhardt. I'm I think 7-year-old organization to the architectural legacy, ability, and sense of the Upper East Side. And the architectural, its livability, place of the Upper East Side are flavored block after block after block, decade after decade after decade by brownstones and terracotta and all the other materials in the wonderful row houses in the neighborhood. I wanted to in New York, the book that had really almost just hit the stands was the wonderful Brownstone Bible, the first edition by Charles Lockwood. I happen to have my copy of the first edition right here. And if you see the print, you will see that I sullied the book by outlining things. And I underlined it in yellow, sometimes yellow highlighter. I used orange. I really, really wanted to digest this wonderful book because it was the first thing that had really come out to cover this topic, and by the wonderful Charles Lockwood, who started it, may know, as a thesis at Princeton. He unfortunately died way, way too young. I only met him a couple of times. He was a lovely guy, very generous with his time and, of course, his knowledge. But I have to confess, when I read the book, I was living in a row house, obviously converted to apartments, on the west side. Then I moved to the east side. And those are parts of the book that are very slim. The east side was covered in about 5 paragraphs. The upper west side, which had at that time such an enormous influence on the Brownstone Bible movement. It was a hot thing in real development at the time. So they were missing from the book, the wonderful book. And one of them, by the way, was any pictures at all in color. Everything, I think, at least in this edition, first edition, was black and white. Up comes the wonderful Ciccone, who has done this edition that he will talk about today, and you can get behind him there, and you can tell that things are in color now. He took this on as a labor of love. He worked on what was going to be the update, and then when Charles sadly, he took the ball and carried it through the goalpost. It's a book. I encourage you to go get it. It's a at this otherwise very difficult time, and it's not just beautiful. It's full of scholarship. That's the other part of it. This is really a very thorough and scholarly effort to update the Brownstone Bible, Bricks and Brownstone Bible. So with that, I think I will turn the screen over to Patrick, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say. And thank you very much for joining us. This was supposed to happen in the spring, but here we are in the fall, and we're going to be together. It's all yours, Patrick.
Well, I thank everyone for joining us tonight, and thank Franny and Laura for putting this together. This isn't quite the same as presenting in the Arsenal in Central Park. I'm in my kitchen in my apartment in Brooklyn, but we'll try to make do with that. So what I'm going to do tonight first is share the screen so you can follow along. Okay, so I'm going to try to talk for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we're going to go to questions. And based on what we're going to see a little bit of the Upper East Side, but we're going to return to that. We can return to that in questions as well. As mentioned, it didn't feature a huge role in the original book, and it has somewhat of a cameo appearance in the new version of the book. But that's for a reason. So we'll see that as we go forward. New York is a city of houses. This may not be obvious in a city now more famous for its skyscrapers and apartment buildings, not to mention its loft buildings and tenements. However, it is the row house, or brownstone, as it is more popularly known, that remains the essential building block for understanding New York's form. Even though many sections of the city, especially in Manhattan, have since been rebuilt, often many times over. These houses remain the markers of New York's urbanity and scale against which newer buildings must be measured. Though the street grid created the armature of the city's future shapes, it was house rows that fleshed out that form into buildings. Built in successive waves of real estate development from the early 1800s onward, row houses were the first structures to be constructed after outlying farmland was divided into building lots. So I'm going to take you sort of backward in time in these slides. This is a row of Maple Street Prospect Lefford Gardens of turn of the 20th century Renaissance revival houses with a beautiful streetscape. Then we can go back in time. We're not going to see the same houses, but we're going to go see it denuded of trees in this range or monumental streetscape of brownstone fronts on West 46th Street, photographed actually around the same time. Then going back even further in time, you can see these houses in Harlem, and you can see these row houses in rows of 3 under construction before these houses had gone, before the streets had been filled together to create a streetscape. Here you can get some idea of what the houses were springing from in the land, and you can see it even further in this view from the top of the Dakota looking over West 72nd Street of the row houses under construction. These are actually also designed by Henry Hardenberg, and you can see at the very middle of the screen, you can actually see the shell of the building being constructed above the building lot. And why is the building lot important? To figure out why the city was a city of row houses in the 19th century. You have the 1811 grid plan on the screen. And I'm going to read you a quote that will probably sound familiar today, but actually comes from 1878. New York is fast becoming a city of only the very rich and the very poor, the American Architect and Building News wrote in 1878. According to the magazine, the row house itself was to blame, as the city's 25 by 100 foot building lots, the same ones created by the gridiron plan, encouraged the construction of houses for single families, in quote, in which only the rich can afford to live, or on the same side parcel, a tenement that housed many families at once, often in substandard conditions. It was in the latter where the majority of the city's 19th century population lived. So the Upper East Side actually features both of these worlds in its original constructions of row houses west of 3rd Avenue and of tenements east. Not that that's a strict geographic boundary. We'll return to that later in the presentation, but I would like to just answer 4 basic questions for you. What is a row house? Seems like a simple question. Who designed them? Where do they survive? Then why do they stop being built? The first one is the easiest. The row house is a single family house constructed on a building lot. 25 by 100 foot lot is the standard building lot. However, these were compressed into narrower forms than that typically. So here you see 37 and 39 Charlton Street in the Village, which gives a good idea on the outside of the configuration of the typical row house that everyone knows, but I feel like it's still basic. It's still important to run through the basic formula. You have the parlor floors reached up the stoop stairs. There's the kitchen and dining room below in the ground floor basement level. Then the bedrooms above. You can see this in the building plan here. This is from the Historic American Building Survey from the 30s. The house. This house had a bathroom added to it in the closet space, but this basic configuration expanded into greater form with more parlors. Really is the basic row house form constructed throughout the 19th century, all across Manhattan and Brooklyn. So again, super briefly, we can put this up longer if it's to be legible. Basement floor at the bottom left, you have a dining room and kitchen. First floor, you have 2 parlors. And then the upper floors, you have the bedrooms. The very top, of course, would have been the servants' floors. So that's the first question. These obviously developed many exterior styles and interior styles, but this is the basic urban form, and the reason that they were constructed was to house single families, at least originally. Who designed these houses? The houses were typically designed by architect builders, not trained professional architects that we imagine today. So they worked in conjunction with developers. The skill of architects, obviously, throughout the 19th century may have become more advanced, but typically this is vernacular architecture. It's not high style architecture. The slide you have on the screen is sort of in its most poignant, fascinating. This is from the New York Historical Society archive of a Brooklyn architect named Martin, C.W. Martins, who was born in London. He was an architect, but probably also a developer. So his house plans, he's actually recycled his molding profiles, which are all in this file. Kind of just an amazing find. Third question, where do these houses survive? To imagine what the city looked like in the early 19th century and what the city looked like at the turn of the 20th century, you have to imagine Manhattan filling up from the Battery, and then a succession of uptown development with row houses the vanguard of development. And that a fashionable neighborhood is every couple of decades, a new fashionable neighborhood and district is created, which really supersedes the previous one. In Brooklyn, which we're not going to talk that much about, but is actually more of a focus of the book and where houses survive, these neighborhoods are not redeveloped for commerce and for skyscrapers and for loft buildings. However, in Manhattan, they are. So this is a view from 1860 looking south from roughly Union Square, and you can see the city blanketed in row houses. And you can imagine that later, throughout the 19th century, of the uptown movement, as fashionable neighborhoods go from the Battery to Bond Street and environs, to Washington Square, to Lower Fifth Avenue, to Murray Hill, northward along Fifth Avenue, but not necessarily to the Upper East Side until the turn of the 20th century. So you can actually see a view here of this uptown development reaching the East Side in the East 70s. This is 74th Street. This is photographed at in the 19-teens. But the East Side was developed largely initially with these upper middle class or even more modest middle class row housing, was not developed as a fashionable district. So this gets to the last question I had of the four sort of basic subject areas we're going to cover about the Brownstones. Why did they stop being built? Let me read you a quote from Herbert Crawley in 1903. He was the architecture critic for Architectural Record and the New Republic. He said that the high stoop brownstone had become, quote, extremely unfashionable, both in design and plan. But not only did it become unfashionable, it was really impossible for anyone to make money developing row houses for the upper middle class and even upper class clientele that had preferred them throughout the 19th century. And apartment buildings won out in favor of the row house. So pretty quickly at the end of the 19th century, and we have could actually pull some numbers that are from the book, there's only a handful of speculative developed architect design row houses being built in Manhattan. They continue to be built in Brooklyn, where there are lower land costs and less of a demand. In the Upper East Side, what happens is that these speculatively built, mass-produced row houses, brownstones, are actually converted into what today we would call townhomes. In much of the Upper East Side streetscape, certainly not all of it, but much of the Upper East Side streetscape are these architect designed townhomes from the early 20th century and even into the subsequent decades. And obviously the apartment houses developed there. This is from an article from 1906 in Architectural Record showing what the new New York house is, describing all these people converting brownstones into neo-Georgian, neo-federal houses without high stoops. And you can see the house marooned here. Put this into this presentation, just some more images from the same time. They're not the best resolution photos, but if you just go around images of the Upper East Side from this era, you'll see these relatively intact brownstones from the 1870s and 1860s that were regarded as dowdy and old-fashioned only 30 years later, next to these new architect designed townhomes, sometimes themselves speculatively built as well, or designed for clients, but complete transformations. So the Upper East Side is this fascinating case where the fashionable district was predicted to stop somewhere uptown, but it was thought that it would actually be a new district rather than an existing one. But what happened is actually the opposite. The existing district, already built out with row houses, developed into the fashionable district of apartment homes and houses that we know today. We can return to that at the end. So next part, I just wanted to trace briefly the decline of the brownstone and how the book, the era where the book was originally written by Charles Lockwood in the 60s and early 70s. So in the 1920s, it was sort of recognized that this era of New York was entirely ending, that this was a thing of the past. So from 1926, I like to read this quote from this article, sort of this wistful appreciation of what then was known as the Gaslight era, and recognizing that the row house was something that was of almost lost New York at that point. So quote, "Long blocks of these solidly respectable houses are yielding to the record. Before long, the saunterer who looks for remains of old New York will have to look twice to find a brownstone front. In almost every cross street of central Manhattan, from river to river, the dignity of brownstone gives way to shining new structures that rise higher." And as you know, in that era, on Upper East Side and the Upper West Side, the Lower Village, there are new apartment buildings built over row houses. In Midtown and other parts of the city, what had once been row house districts were demolished in favor of commercial buildings. This most poignantly in this photograph from 1939, I believe on West 58th Street, of this row of brownstone fronts being demolished. Somehow that I don't know why they demolished it this way, but they've left the parlor floor and the basements intact. You can sort of see the houses being ripped from the city's fabric in that way. But remember also that the brownstone itself, brownstone as a material and as a way of living, was almost universally derided by that point. Obviously, on the East Side, there are houses that have been modified and changed into townhomes, but we can sort of look at the disdain for this era with Edith Wharton in A Backward Glance. I'm going to go to another Edith Wharton quote, but I don't want to ruin it for a second. But in 1934, her autobiography, A Backward Glance, she described these same Italian brownstone front houses of Lower Fifth Avenue with contempt and a, quote, desperate uniformity of style. And then you probably know the most famous one in the Age of Innocence, that brownstone was the uniform hue that coated New York like a cold chocolate sauce. This was written in the 20s, set in the late 19th century, where all of this stuff had fallen into disdain. So how did brownstones and row houses go to being something that was considered obsolete and something almost to be discarded to something that was appreciated? Well, there's a thread throughout the early 20th century is that the earliest houses in the city are appreciated and are starting to be rediscovered. This to some degree is part of what we would call the colonial revival interest, but Montgomery Schuyler, one of the most severe architecture critics around, looks at the small city house in New York and sort of declares these early federal homes in some ways perfect. So there is a thread of appreciation for earlier houses at this point, even as how row houses are falling out of fashion or unable to be built for economic reasons. So in 1940, there's the first study that was written of the New York house. This is actually a handwritten thesis at Columbia when Talbot Hamilton was there about the New York house to 1850, which was sort of a precursor to bricks and brownstone. Then classic New York, Ada Louise Huxtable's great book from 1964, also sort of forms this basis for appreciation, not just of row houses, but of the vernacular city. Not going to go into the whole history of the historic preservation movement at the same time, but I'd like to read just a little quote from this book because it gets you into the mind of what you need to see when you see row houses and other vernacular architecture. She said, "These accidental and anonymous survivors of the city's early years may be gone before this guide ever reaches the reader's hands. Some in can should be saved. Some are beyond saving. All are a special problem in preservation, but they are not monuments or masterpieces, but a more modest part of the city's original fabric. They rank as street architecture rather than rather than as high style designs. So you have to see these for something completely different than we look at monuments as collections of buildings together. So when Charles Lockwood, the original author of the book, started researching the book when he was a senior at Princeton in the late 1960s. By this time, Brownstoners in the city had started to buy and revive houses, especially in Brooklyn Heights and Park Slope and the West Side. And you can see that against this backdrop, there was an expansion of interest in houses and in brownstones themselves. Hold on, if you could pause 1 second. I need to have my notes below me, but it's been truncated. So you could pause for 1 second. That's why the rest of the Edelweiss Huxtable was clipped. I since she's so eloquent, she said, they rank as street architecture rather than as landmarks. Built as part of the street, they continue to live as part of it, even in incongruous transformations. In isolations, they lose their meaning. That's really, I think, what we see when we see row houses. So in the late 1960s, there was what we would call Brownstoners. And actually, I mean, some of the language today might make us roll our eyes a little. But in the 1960s, the New York City's master plan even said that there was a affluent Brownstoner movement who, quote, in the face of considerable odds and dire predictions, were expending great amounts of money in they don't quite use the word colonizing neighborhoods, but putting money into these. At the same time, even though there was this great interest in row housing, there was actually no book or no history of the row house. And this is how Charlie recalled writing the book, his inspiration to write the book when he was a senior. He went into the Donnell Library on West 53rd Street. He asked the librarian, where could I find a book on New York brownstones? I asked at the reference desk. We don't have one, the librarian said. It's never been written. Are you sure? He asked, somewhat surprised. I'm sure, she replied. So that sort of became the basis of his senior thesis and then what was later published as Bricks and Brownstone. I think that one of the things that really cemented the book and the cityscape together for Charles and for me of the book's role in New York City history was this moment in 1970. On March 6, 1970, the Weather Underground blew up by accident a house on West 11th Street. Charles and the original photographer Robert Meyer were actually on the same street photographing Greek Revival doorways when the house exploded. Their photograph is on the front page of the Times the next day. So Charles was a very warm, engaging historian that loved being out on the street and not just writing the book. This was a moment when he was only 22 that sort of tied this history together in this flashpoint, and in some ways, became part of the mythology of the original book and of the way he presented himself. So we're going to go briefly through the original book and what I ended up changing in revising. You can see here on the screen, this is a picture of all various editions of the book. The first 1972 edition, another issue, a reprint reissued in '84. In the early 2000s, Rizzoli and Charles worked on a reissue of the book that had color photography, but did not revise the basic text of the book or the history at all. This is a beautiful book, but it still was the book from 1970. I started working with Charles at Columbia's Preservation School in 2006, and he always wanted to revisit what he had left out or somewhat shifted in the book. He died of cancer in 2012 and left me this project, and I had to figure out how to approach it and what needed to change. The book is very comprehensive for house styles and history up to really about 1875 or so. After that, and where there are more styles and a greater amount of surviving houses, there's simply less featured in the book. So the way it started out was gathering photography first of exteriors that hadn't been captured really at all in the original book. Ended up working with a great photographer, Dylan Chandler, on this. Scouting. I would first scout on bicycle. Basically, went to every row house neighborhood in the city, and then directed him, for certain details or for certain shots. So first, we went around cataloging the eclectic houses, the 1880s and 1890s. You can see some details on this Romanesque house on the left in Bedford-Stuyvesant. On the right, the grill work in Prospect Heights, and then on the left, a house in Park Slope on Union Street, and then also documenting Renaissance revival houses here across from Jamel Terrace, this row of houses on Mount Morris Park West, and then ending up with these neo-federal houses from 1917 that are in Flatbush, that look a lot like these small city houses that Montgomery Schuyler wrote about. Once we started gathering these photographs and obviously the historical research to support the text, we realized that it was impossible just to graft this onto the existing book. The original photographs are quite good, and Charles and Robert Meyer, the original photographer, had the foresight to not include any any cars in the photographs. Cars are the thing that most immediately date any architectural photograph. At the same time, we couldn't present these side by side, so ended up reshooting really everything in the book entirely and not reusing any of the original photography from the book. So this goes back to the Federal era, house on Charles Street and a mantle on Charlton Street, to the Greek Revival. We see the Washington Square North, this amazing dappled sunlight, to the plaster ceiling medallion at the Merchants House Museum, the Italianate here on the left, an individual house on Columbia Heights, and then on the right, this row of houses off of Fort Greene Park in Brooklyn. And at the same time, what we wanted to do with the book was capture more interiors. It's one of the most difficult things to do, not just from a logistical standpoint of finding people that want to share their homes, but of presenting something that will not be dated as well by contemporary furnishings or stuff like that, if the books survive for another couple of decades at least. But wanted to show that it was possible to live in houses both in some kind of period fashion, not period fashion, with period details intact, and also to show that to go against the all too common trend these days of destroying the interior of houses entirely. So you can see a few attempts to show this in the book. On the left, you can see there is the entry doorway of an Italian house in Prospect Heights, then going into its parlor. And this is a parlor of a Greek Revival Italianate sort of hybrid in the Village. These are more modern interiors, and even to the extent of ones where the walls are white. At the same time, showing more elaborate stuff like this sort of fantasy of Victoriana on the left in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Otis Pratt Pearsall's house on the right on Willow Street. So to capture all these and to remind that there's a basic integrity that no matter how one wants to live in these houses, that it would be a good idea to maintain. And I also wanted to show people enough pictures that even in apartments in divided row houses, you'd be able to put it together in a similar idea of what's there. So want to wrap up and go to questions. Just wanted to sort of put the book into context of where we are in New York City's urbanism of today. This is the Washington Square North again, which is in the very background. You can also see a taller building constructed in the 1920s, but want to leave this as food for thought and for discussion. Though constructed as single-family homes, New York's row houses for over 2 centuries have proven suitable to many future lives. Rather than enforcing uniformity, the complaint long levied at Brownstones, row houses tend to create instead a dense but not overwhelming streetscape, and one, through the many entrances and size of the building themselves, promotes a lively variety and human scale that no other form of New York building has since matched. This urbanism is also wonderful simply for its splendor. New York's row houses display some of the city's most glorious vernacular architecture. From the classicism of the federal style, the austere Greek revival, the showy Italianate, the eclecticism of Queen Anne and Romanesque revival, to the academic Beaux-Arts, to name just a few. Together, where these survive, these houses form what is part gallery, part library, part stage set, but also more than all those things combined, since beauty, history, and scenography together create the cityscape in which we lead our daily lives. Today, as New York continues to be rebuilt into even taller and more crystalline form, the skyline and streets of boom areas suffer from a placelessness, which has perhaps less to do with the architectural quality of the buildings themselves than their disconnect from the city from which they spring. New York, of course, has been and will always be ever-changing and dynamic, but this historic cityscape must continue to undergird the spiritual as well as the real city. A city, in its most real sense, is its buildings, Ada Louise Huxtable wrote in classic New York. The structures that its inhabitants have erected for their use and pride, even the buildings that have come and gone, and in a way those buildings are disposed upon the streets and squares, are the source of its personality, its style, its distinguishing stamp. The brownstone remains, and hopefully will remain for centuries to come, the architectural foundation of New York's collective sense of identity and place. So with that, I'd like to move to the questions.
Thank you, Patrick. This was wonderful. Before we go to the questions, I'm going to ask everyone to, if you're willing, if you want to, start your video. And if you have any questions, just please send them via chat and we will hopefully get to them. I will start with a question. You talked a lot about our beautiful row houses in New York City. What other cities have a legacy of row houses? Any places that we should visit after travel is safe?
Well, that is a big question mark if we're ever allowed to leave anywhere. I think the foremost among them is London. London is sort of, in many ways, is an even greater row house city than New York, because there are more of them and they're spread out wider, and they may, to some extent, survive in greater numbers. So I would say that and they are very similar to New York's, but that's actually also where you see some of the difference in urbanism and the time that they were built. The ones in London actually date from slightly earlier, so in some ways they're less mass produced, even though there are many of them, that a lot of the building trades and building technology that we associate with row housing in New York didn't exist. So that the earlier ones are plainer. To me, I like them better. They were talking about Georgian houses, and then are built from a wider variety of eras. There you can also see a complete difference of urbanism from New York to London to New York, is that's where estates are divided. There's parks, small parks created. There's still ground leases. New York is the sort of tyranny of the grid plan, where everything is divided into building lots sold off on speculation. So that's definitely the different. I would say that London is the big one. Throughout the East Coast, we have Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, even Washington, D.C. They're all very, very similar to some degree in that there's a lot of row housing. The biggest difference is that New York, because of the extreme cost of urban land, is that after the 1830s, at least in Manhattan, there are almost no houses built for lower middle class or even truly middle class. So in Philadelphia and Baltimore, you have tens of thousands of really small row houses that in some ways, there's obviously differences in urban history too. They've proven less adaptable for a variety of reasons. I think partially just because they're harder to divide. They're truly modest houses, where there's some benefit that New York had to create such density and overwhelming scale, even on row houses, that they proved easier to divide into apartments. To think of something like the Upper West Side, where those side street houses that are 5-story and tall or so, they were built for single families, but they're something like 7,000 to 9,000 square feet. They're really much more suitable as 10 small apartments than as a single family house. So that's the short way of answering it, but go to London if you can get it.
All right, thank you. I'm gonna merge a few questions into a few questions, but you said that you retook all the photos from the original book. How many of those were not there anymore when you went to take the photos? And which neighborhood do you see the greater number of survival? And is there any historical style, architecture style that is like survived more than the other?
You know, I'd say that there's very few outright losses of anything that was in the book. I'd say that the book had the original book had a pretty good template for what was significant, and was written at the same time as a lot of those buildings were being designated. I think that, unfortunately, as hinted at with the interiors, is that that's the thing that has been lost more. The way that preservation law works here, there's not really a way to protect them, but it is sort of a change in ethos of the people that are interested in purchasing them are really viewing them as boxes to be obliterated rather than taking something from the inside. So there's certainly interiors that were photographed that don't exist anymore. I would say that, you know, to make the same joke again, is that the real challenge is just that New York's, to maintain a historic building, there's so much going on of scaffolding, facades. We managed to shoot all those wonderful photos of Washington Square North, and then it was in scaffolding for months after that. And it's such a critical part of the book that, you know, we ended up in that window. And I would say that the other irony is that the neighborhoods that are the wealthiest have the most change. Or maybe it's not irony, it's just perhaps immediately counterintuitive. As you know, the said on the Upper East Side is actually where the original houses have been most drastically altered into something completely different, into townhomes, and then in neighborhoods that sort of had some money, but, you know, were not super wealthy, like Carroll Gardens. Those are where the houses are actually not completely intact, even in historic districts. And you go out to poor neighborhoods in more distant parts of Brooklyn, those are where everything survives because no one has invested, no one had the resources to change things. But those are where, you know, block after block in Bed-Stuy, you know, probably over 10,000 row houses or more. And so many of the streets, even outside of landmark districts, are pretty intact, or at least not mutilated.
Good. Interesting. We have another question, more technical questions. Are brownstones and row houses required at some point to have outdoor fire escapes? We don't see them as often as we see in tenement buildings. So
this is a code question that I have no idea if I can answer. I think typically they're on the rear when they're divided, but I think that there's just so many permutations of what the legal certificate of occupancy is at the time it was issued that it really varies a lot by era. So there's not one answer. I think that this is one of the ironic things, is that a lot of the row housing in the city is actually, the apartment divisions are not legal. So it's something that you encounter all the time, is that there's four apartments in a building that's only legal for 3. So stuff like that. But there's not one good answer for that.
All right. And also in this idea of having a row house divided into multifamily buildings, you talk a lot about how they were designed as single family houses. Were there any row houses that were designed as multifamily? Or,
you know, there are a handful of buildings. More of them are in Brooklyn, that you can see the difference in them between a single family house and these buildings, and the parlor floor and the upper floors are the same size. So there are some modest apartment buildings, let's say in Park Slope, that are they have a 4 apartments per floor, but they look like a row house. So that is sort of the in between version of it. But really in 19th century New York, at least in Manhattan, it was sort of recognized that you're always building this first wave of residential construction, and then it will be converted to boarding houses. Then it will be torn down for a commercial building or a tenement. So it's really astonishing when you go back and look at the city of that era, how rapidly it changes and how constantly people are moving all the time. So.
Mm-hmm. And another question, you talked about the many different architecture styles that the row houses have. Do you go in depth about the different styles in the book, and how also do you talk about how they developed and changed over time as well?
So one of the challenges with doing this new edition of the book is that the Charles's original book was written it was a stylistic and social history, but it was the chapters were actually divided by style. So the book there was the Federal was the first chapter, Greek Revival. There was a large chapter on Gothic Revival, which doesn't feature many houses. Then a chapter on Italianate, and then there was a chapter on a lot of other things. One of the challenges had in writing this and including the history of the late 19th century is that there are so many different styles that aren't really even you can present as one style necessarily. So you have to sort of acknowledge that eclecticism, and that's sort of one of the things we ended up writing, trying to divide the book a little bit differently chronologically, that there's eras where these things are predominant, but that there's always variations and permutations of it. I think one of the most fascinating things that I found out and put in there is that I found an architect writing in, I think, the 1880s, basically saying that eclecticism was modern, like that there's not everyone else was just copying historical styles. Now architects can assemble everything together. So what today we sort of view as like this like kind of like almost like lost or crazy collection of different things, at the time they were viewing that as modern architecture, that you could pick and choose and be the artist. So I don't know if that's a good answer, but I think that many people listening in here and who are architecture buffs, your friends or relatives always asking, well, what style is it? And there's an answer, but sometimes there isn't. And again, this is New York City. Most buildings only have one side, they're a box. So a lot is happening in a very short span. I mean, a short amount of distance, and the rest of it is just the box behind. And it's no different with a row house or with a commercial building. That's what I wanted to say at the beginning of, there is just a great continuity, despite how different they look. I think that you want to think more of continuity rather than difference, at least looking from the 1780s to the 1920s.
Mm-hmm. Great. Still about style, we've got a wonderful question. Were the style names chosen at the time when they were being designed, or did they get those titles later on with critics?
Well, this is a great question, because this was one of the big challenges of doing this edition, is that a lot of these names actually were applied later, or at least modified, and was always worried that we're basically have to undo stuff to realize, no, this wasn't what the thing was called ever, and we should rename it. We're sort of caught in between, is that the stuff that we know by certain names, we don't have to was never going to be able to change anyway. But with neo-Grec houses, for example, which is sort of these angular houses that look very similar to Italianate houses, it wasn't really that widely used of a term at the time, and could apply to a lot of different things, even to the extent that someone writing at a time said, why it's called this, we don't know, because it's neither new nor Greek. So the answer is that a lot of it is is applied later. But this is sort of the process of, it's why this makes this to me endlessly fascinating as a preservationist, is that these things, preservation, you're constantly dealing with an old thing that exists in the present, how to classify it, how to deal with it, and name it. And it's a very different type of history than other stuff that you can just put away or forget about. Buildings, these, as I was trying to say at the end, these are still the spaces we live our lives in. They're not something on a shelf. So you're constantly trying to frame and understand where they came from and how we put them in context today.
Yeah. Patrick, this was wonderful. We're almost approaching an hour, so thank you for joining us. I think I speak for everyone here that this talk was wonderful, and I dropped in the chat the link to purchase the book if you'd like. I was just telling Patrick, I just ordered my copy today right before this this talk. And if you have any more questions, or if we didn't get to your question today, just email me and I'll forward them to Patrick. And again, as a reminder, this talk was recorded, and as time permits, it's going to be up on our website and YouTube for future viewing. So thank you, and everyone have a good night.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Laura and Frank.